Muted. Okay. Hello, everyone. Salam. Thank you for coming back. Caffeinated and fed. Especially on this rainy day today. Arabi took a lot of rain in his tarjuma. Lots of rain. But let's take the cue. Maybe I put a line from Ibn al-ʿArabi. Okay. Let the rain of the stars be yours, and that for the news. Please join me in welcoming Professor Oludamini Associate Professor of African Religious Studies, African Religious Thought and Democracy at the University of Virginia. He specializes in Sufism and Hindu religious traditions in West Africa, particularly the intellectual and aesthetic dimension, as well as cross-cultural and deep philosophy. His last book, published in 2020, is titled Deep Knowledge, Ways of Knowing, Sufism, and Metaphysics. Without further ado, please welcome Professor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, the Muhyiddin Ibn al-ʿArabi Society, Columbia University, especially Professor Ali Qadri for the tremendous efforts in making this wonderful conference happen. I'd really like to thank Professor Sheik and Professor Murata for being here, for their inspiration. That's really a lot of us owe a lot of our work to their works and their mentorship and support too. So I'm going to try to go very quickly. This is a 45-minute presentation that I've tried to whittle down into 15 minutes. So I'm going to talk to you today about Sheik Dan Tafa, who was a Sufi in the tradition and scholar in the tradition of Ibn al-ʿArabi in West Africa and what today is Nigeria. So unfortunately, I still have to do this kind of preamble whenever I talk about Islamic figures in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe in a few years I won't, but I feel like I still have to do this. So there are two theses that have really haunted the study of Islam in Africa. They've been widely disproven, but their legacies live on. The first is the thesis of intellectual decline, which is the idea that Ibn Rushd was the last Islamic philosopher, or maybe the last Islamic philosopher in the West, or this related idea that philosophical Sufism of greats like Rumi and Ibn al-ʿArabi gave way to a kind of pietistic, magical, or political Sufism from maybe the 15th, 13th century onwards, depending on who you read, or maybe in just the Islamic West. So this idea that, we used to have these great Muslim intellectuals and thinkers, but then Muslims just started playing with their tasbihs and doing magic squares and stuff like that until they discovered oil and had the Nahda in the 20th century. Now, it's been widely disproven in the literature, but the legacy of this still lingers on in the popular imagination. The other thesis is that of Islam noir, which is kind of elegantly summed up by my colleague Rudolf Ware in his book that Arab or Persian culture plus Islam is just Islam. But African culture plus Islam is some kind of syncretist, primitive, magical, racialized Islam. Now, this pays attention to race and geography instead of isnad, chains of transmission. And at least the people I study, anyway, the geography matters mainly in terms of isnad, these chains of transmission. So you have people who live very near to each other, but the way in which they practice Islam, the text they're reading, the way they pray, the things they do, you can learn a lot more about that from their isnad, from the chains of transmission, than you can by just, they're West African. Again, even though these two theses have been widely disproven, one of the consequences of their legacy is that scholars of Islamic intellectual history tend to ignore sub-Saharan Africa completely. Scholars of Islam. Shahab Ahmed wrote a whole book, What is Islam? I think mentioned sub-Saharan Africa 3 times, 4 times, like 3 of them are in footnotes, talking about what is Islam. You're not talking about this. And there are more Muslims in Nigeria than Egypt. While scholars of Islam in Africa tend to neglect the philosophical or intellectual dimensions of the works of sub-Saharan African scholars, focusing instead on their historical, political, legal writings in social historical contexts. So we will not be doing that today. So I want to talk to you about Sheik Dan Tafa. He was the grandson of Usman Dan Fodio, the founder of sometimes called the Sokoto Caliphate in scholarship. And he was born right in the middle of the Hijra that started the Sokoto Jihad. So he was like born on the 4th of July. He was born to Usman Dan Fodio's daughter and one of his main students, Malam Tafa. That's why he's called Dan Tafa, the son of Tafa, Mustafa. So he was born in the middle of the Hijra. He received his spiritual training under his maternal uncle, Usman Dan Fodio's son, Muhammad Sanbu. He started at age 15, and then he achieved his sheikhhood at age 18, and then he was further instructed to study the outward sciences. He studied logic, mathematics, poetry, medicine, natural and occult sciences, grammar, jurisprudence, hadith, theology, and much, much more. Pretty much all of the Islamic sciences that were circulating in that time in that region of what's now northern Nigeria. He was put in charge of his father's school at Salame when his father, Malam Tafa, died in 1845, and he died at the age of 60 in 1864, 1279, and he's buried behind the school. This is a picture of his grave. He is widely known throughout the West African region, even as far away as Timbuktu and other places, as the most learned scholar of his generation in the Sokoto Caliphate, which at the time was the largest polity by population in sub-Saharan Africa. So Heinrich Barth, a German explorer, met him there and called him the most learned scholar. And this is a picture of his grave. This is a picture of his great-great-grandson who lives in Sudan. And this is a picture of his great-great-great-grandson who lives in Nigeria, who I got to meet this summer. All right, to give you a sense, just very briefly, Dan Tafa has a lot of interesting works. One of my favorites is this work, Uhud wa Mawathiq, a collection of oaths that he took at the hand of the Namus al-Akbar, he calls it, probably the angel Jibril. So one of them, he says, I've taken an oath and a covenant to spread the wing of mercy to all things in creation and to view them with the same eye with which the real viewed them when he desired to create them. In this, I desire all good and sympathy for them, to extend affection and kindness to all of them, regardless of their believers, disbelievers, righteous, sinful, human, jinn, animals, plants, stones, or mere clouds of mud. To this extent, I've made it obligatory to daily make an all-embracing supplication for the good of all creation, saying, O God, be merciful to them and suffice them when they are incapable. I say this 3 times every day and intend by to fulfill the oath of the duty of holding back evil from them to the best of my ability. Another one he said that I thought was very interesting for us as academics. I've taken an oath and covenant that I will not oppose or contend with anyone in a way in which that person may dislike, even when the bad character of the individual requires me to. For contending with others in ways that are disliked is repugnant and harmful beyond reckoning. This oath is extremely difficult to uphold. So may God assist us to fulfill it by means of his benevolence and kindness. So I just wanted to give you a little sense of what Dan Tafa, the person, was like. This conference is about translation. Now, Dan Tafa did translate some works. He mostly translated works by his family from Fulfulde into Arabic, interestingly. So this knowledge and texts were going both ways in these languages, not just from Arabic into local languages, but from local languages into Arabic. But I'm not going to talk about those translations. When I looked up the etymology of the English word translation, one of the early meanings you find in Latin and French is the removal of a saint's body or relics from one place to another. And so what I want to look at is, how does Dan Tafa achieve this kind of translation, which is, how do you move marifa? How do you move wilaya? How do you move marifa from one person to another, from one place to another? How do you move wilaya? So I'm going to look at this. Now, this should be understood in this context. Even the transfer of ilm from one person to another, regular kind of ordinary knowledge, in the classical Islamic context, is not as easy as just like picking up a book and reading it. So William Graham, in a great study on kind of learning in classical Islamic society, says, in classical Islamic teaching environments, truth does not reside in documents, however authentic, ancient, or well-preserved, but rather in authentic human beings and their personal connections with one another. So even on the level of ilm, for things like hadith and learning fiqh and things like that, the truth doesn't lie in the documents, it's in the people. So Imam Shatibi, famous Andalusian Maliki scholar whose writings are widely studied in West Africa, he said knowledge was in the chests of men, then it was transferred to books with its keys still in the hands of men. And Amadou Hampate Ba, 20th century Tijani author, famously said, writing is one thing and knowledge another. Writing is like the photographing of knowledge, but it's not knowledge itself. Knowledge is a light which is within man. It's the heritage of all the ancestors knew and have transmitted to us as seed, just as the mature baobab itself is contained in the seed. And his most famous quote is, "In Africa, when an elder dies, it's a library burning down." Right, so even in this context, just the transmission of ordinary knowledge is not a simple matter. So the translation, then, we can understand as moving between speech or writing and realization. I can talk to you all day long, but how is it that you get what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to convey? Or transmission between people. And in Dan Tafa's works, he describes different ways in which this happens, in which he learned and studied things. So one is through oral transmission or writing, through sam or not hearing things. One is kind of in-person spiritual transmission. So he sits with the Shaykh gives him a lesson, some isharas, things like that, but he's in the physical presence of a Shaykh, and some knowledge or realization is transferred from person to person. Then you have these in-person, kind of in quotes, spiritual transmission of knowledge, which can occur in waking visions of people, in which they kind of come down and you see them awake, but these are people who have been long dead, or jinn or other things like that. In dreams as well, so people can come in dreams and convey knowledge. He has a whole treatise that was provoked by his Shaykh, his Shaykh recently passed, coming to him in a dream and telling him to write something. And then when he, and this is also following, Ibn al-ʿArabi has these three examples as well too, discorporealizes himself from his body and goes as a spirit into these other realms and interacts with other spirits, and they exchange knowledge in that way. So these are some ways. And then all of it always is from God. Sometimes you just get it from God directly without any of these kind of regular intermediaries, but that's the case in all of these. Anyway, so I'll look quickly at this dynamics in two poems of his. One is a poem on Sufi nomenclature, kind of explanation of technical vocabulary with his own commentary that he wrote based on Abdul Karim Ajili, a famous Akbari author based in Yemen, his famous book, Al-Insan al-Kamil. And the next is a book of 66, next poem of 66 lines called Shukr al-Wahib, Thanking the Giver. So in some other works, though, he describes how this process of transmission works kind of as a form of translation. So we asked his Sheikh, Muhammad Sanbu, about the people, about Wahda al-Mutlaqa, absolute oneness. So he said, I'd read the statements of Ibn al-ʿArabi and Shaykh al-Qunawi, the master of the people of oneness, and it seems to me that you, Shaykh, have understood their discourse, and I wasn't content with just repeating the words of both of them. So I wanted what he had, the knowledge of the reality of their discourse. So he started talking to me about the knowledge of forms and the loci of their disclosure. So he said, say there are 30 existential forms, but the reality is one. But the loci of manifestation, the mazahir, are multiple. And he said to me, do you know that this is possible, right? So you have one thing in 30 mirrors, and then you get 30 reflections. And I said, no. So he said to me, like this are the relationships between the loci of manifestation and the reality. Although they are varied, in reality, they are one. My heart was relieved, and I never had problems with the knowledge of forms ever. That was it. That accomplished the translation. So, but in this as well too, so this is an account of this kind of form of transmission, of realization, but in it as well too, I think he's also giving us a clue as to how this translation or transmission works. We have different mirrors. Everything that exists is a kind of different mirror. And these different mirrors are almost like different languages. They have their own shapes. And that single reality, that single meaning, when it's manifest in these different loci of manifestation, takes on a different shape. And so translation or transmission is moving from the reality to the mirror, or maybe moving from one reflection to another. In another, in the same work, he emphasized this in a different way. He asked the Shaykh what the Sufis claim about the vision of the presence of Hadra. And he said to me, he said, look, the presence is a locus of manifestation of essential life, or the life of the essence, and it's a place of self-disclosure of living perfection. It takes form in the beginningless obscurity, wrapped in the robes of the first self-disclosure. No eye falls upon it, and for it no how or nowhere can be perceived, but it has a manifestation in the forms of some of the beliefs of servants. It appears to them in the form in which they believe. It's not the case that they see it really and truly, but rather imaginalized and exemplified. But this vision of it is restricted to the hearts of those whose character is free from impurity and harm. So the real presence, the presence of the real, manifests itself to people in the form of their beliefs, but in that form, it takes on these imaginalized, exemplified forms based on their constitution, and only if their hearts are clean and pure. So again, we have translation movement from the presence, which is wrapped in the hiddenness of the first self-disclosure and can't be seen by any eye, to a form that can be visible, but it's conditioned, and it's conditioned in every believer differently. Again, if any of you are familiar with Ibn al-ʿArabi, you know this is straight from discussions in the Fusus and Futuhat. So now let's turn to his poem on Sufi nomenclature. So he says, I took this book, Dilis Insan al-Kamil, by means of transmission, naql, from my spiritual master, the righteous teacher, ascetic sage, knower by God, my maternal uncle, Muhammad Sambu. And he in turn took it from his father, Sheikh Usman ibn Fodio, or may God have mercy on both of them. Due to his frequent study of the issues of this book, he benefited me greatly. Then I myself began a deep study of the text repeatedly until I completely possessed it, realized it, and extracted from it in numerous rare extractions. Among them was a poem, which I composed regarding the technical vocabulary of the book, upon its chapters and 30 verses. And I wrote a commentary on this. And then I wrote another poem, which was like an intro to the thing, but I lost that many years ago. And there are a lot of other works. And he said, God gave me openings in this book, which he had not given to others. So he gets this transmission from his teacher. He's studying it on his own. He's writing like summaries, reports on the book. And in this process, he's getting openings from God through the process of engaging with this textual material transmitted to him by his teacher. In fact, he says, rather, I don't know anyone in these times after my above-mentioned spiritual master who had uncovered the secrets with which I become acquainted from studying this book. And the book is, it is as it's promised. It discusses technical vocabulary that you'll see in the later Akbari tradition. What are the 2 feet? What are the 2 sandals? What's the first, the Tayyun al-Awwal, the first entification? What is these different things? It's really good. And he wrote this when he was 17 lunar years old, right? It's a 16-year-old, imagine a high schooler doing something like this. So it's a really, actually very useful work if anybody wants a kind of intro to Akbar vocabulary. But he concludes this work by saying, I've explained these words. I made this commentary condensed as a precaution against unwanted incursion and fitna. I relied on this book, the Perfect Man, but if not for the universal mercy of God, where would I be in this? But this is the gift of the real. It's beneficial at every moment. It never ceases time after time. And then he says, explains why he wrote this. I was only driven to undertake this composition in order to seek benefit and to benefit others, and to encourage the spiritual zeal of those who possess desire and hope for husn, for goodness, beauty, and increase. That is the whole purpose of explaining this vocabulary. It's not to show off. It's not, to get an ijaza or something like that, or to get a job. It's to make others long for the kind of knowledge that he's describing so that you go realize it for yourself, like he did with his Shaykh. And this other book that he actually says he wrote for a very similar reason, this he wrote towards the end of his life. This is a 66-line poem. 66, is the numerical jaf of the name Allah. So I think he did that on purpose. It's called Shukr al-Wahib, giving thanks for the giver. And he said he wrote this to give thanks to God for the blessings of knowledge that he had given him. And so he lists all the forms of knowledge that he acquired and the means that he acquired them. So he starts, I begin in the name of the creator of lights, in the veil of hearts and insights, not for fame or in order to boast due to them, but rather desiring by means of them to have increase in them. So I praise God, the one who guided me, to show gratitude to him for the love he has shown me. So he starts off explaining he learned the sciences of the Sharia. So like Arabic language, fiqh, theology, sunnah, hadith, tafsir, Sufism of ethics. And he said he learned this by transmission, studying things with teachers, by memorization and study. Then he goes to the sciences of the ancients, ulum al-awa'il, like medicine, arithmetic, logic, astronomy, astrology, physics, magic squares, letters, various forms of divination. And he said these he learns by transmission and independent study. Then he goes to the sciences of the realities, ulum al-haqa'iq, like the divine names, divine qualities, the mother of the book, spirits, malakut, the jabarut. And he said these he realized through tahqiq, realization, and elevation, taraqi. Then he discusses the sciences of the saints, the ulum al-awliya, which are the sciences from the mysteries of the Sufi path, such as attraction, jalb, annihilation, fana, the white plural, the noon, the tablet and the pen, the low tree, the black swamp. And he said these he acquired through suluk, spiritual wayfaring, and jalb, divine attraction. And he says for these sciences, there's no written text nor rational proofs. I only mention them by way of allusion. So we heard about ishara earlier today. I only mention them by way of ishara. Then, but that's just not level 4. Then there's the next level, the sciences of mysteries from outside the Sufi path, such which he again just mentions them by way of allusion. There's not any text for these. He says the living water of Khidr spring, the holy divine sea of Jesus, the opening letters of the surah, these spiritual ternaries, the Hawamim, the Nawamis, the letters of the greatest name. And he said these he got by divine bestowal. God just kind of gave it to him. Then the last level is the sciences of the greatest unveiling, which he describes as the universal circle, additions to the sciences of the prophets, the manifestation of the night and day, sciences of the throne. And he says these sciences are unique to him, his family, and the Muhammadan seal, the seal of Muhammad's sanctity, who he identifies with the Mahdi that was coming. And he said he achieved these in a true dream during sleep without any effort. Right, so these different forms of knowledge came to him, were translated to him in these different ways. So it's a really interesting list for intellectual history and all kinds of things. Okay, so to try to wrap up, if you just look at even just these two works of Dan Tafa's, we can see a very clear and very strong Akbari tradition, that is Ibn al-ʿArabi tradition, in the Sokoto Empire, or Caliphate as it's sometimes called, the Sokoto state, particularly mediated through the works of Abdul Karim Ajili. Usman Danfodio studied them, transmitted to his son, Muhammad Sanbu, who transmitted them to Dan Tafa. And this transmission, again, it's not just conceptual. These weren't just people reading books. They were engaged in very serious spiritual exercises of all kinds, leading to realization. So when we're looking at the kind of transmission of the Akbari tradition, we're looking at this translation in terms of movement of saints' bones, of writings, of marifa. How is it that marifa is moving along with these books and these kind of chains of transmission? And that's something I'm more looking into. So we can look at translation as a transmission of ma'arif, of knowings. They exceed written or spoken discourse, but they also exceeding them. So they're kind of present in them as well. Like he was transmitted the book from his master, but then he spent lots of time reading and working with it on his own and got openings through that. So there's a kind of complex relationship I see in his works between Paul, statements, discursive things, study, the hal, this kind of things, states that you get from spiritually striving or just you receive as a gift, and marifa, in which they're kind of all going back and forth and influencing each other. You can read a book, it puts you in a hal, that hal can lead you to marifa. That marifa can then lead you to write something which might put somebody else or yourself back in a hal, and so on and so forth in lots of different directions. And this is actually, I think, nicely described in, Michael Sells has this in the introduction to his translation of the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. So he writes that Ibn al-ʿArabi writes in an introductory remark in a poem that he has in his other work, Sessions of the Righteous. Ibn al-ʿArabi provides a key to his own understanding of himself as a translator of desires, Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. Eros, Shawq or Ashwaq, comes in two forms or languages: longing for what's in the past or distance, and that's Ashwaq, Shawq, and then longing for what's near or at hand or for what one already has, which Ibn al-ʿArabi calls ishtiyaq. The introduction presents this poem from this work, as authored by the personified Ashwaq. He's quoting Ibn al-ʿArabi here. Among the poems that Ashwaq composed, so longings composed, in the language of ishtiyaq, are what I said regarding Nizam. Nizam, remember, being the beautiful woman he met in Mecca, who prompted the composition of Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. In theological languages, Sheikh Nizam transcends the poem that is about her, but she's also immanent within it. As a muse, Nizam is not only the beloved who inspires the poet's verses, but also the creative spark within them. And if any of you have spent a lot of time with the works of Ibn al-ʿArabi, I think there's a similar thing going on too. He's not only the person who wrote the works, but he's also this creative spark within them. And the same is true with the Prophet and God as well too. They transcend these works, but they're also in them in a mysterious way. So I'll close with a poem that Sheik Dan Tafa used to close his own commentary on Julie's work, which I think sums up at least kind of what I'm trying to do in academia. Said, and if their barakah have not achieved, I'll mention it at length and frequently. There's joy in remembering them repeatedly. It spurs the writer on and gives him speed. If after them I'm left alone, enough for me is that I cling to them dependently. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Professor Shankar Nair. He's Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Vienna. His research interests include Sufism and Islamic philosophy, Quranic exegesis, Hindu philosophy and theology, Hindu-Muslim interaction with South Asia, Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit literature, and the general intellectual history of the Indian subcontinent. The latest book, published in 2020, is titled Translating Wisdom, Hindu-Muslim Intellectual Interactions in Early Modern South Asia. Dr. Nair has been working with Hindu.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Ali, to Sophie, to Columbia, to the Ibn al-ʿArabi Society, to everybody involved. It's been a pleasure. Forgive me for being a little brief in my thank yous. But I also have an overlong paper that I have to try to stuff into 15 minutes. Thank you, of course, Professors Murata and Sheikh for being here as well. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. And as I think any of you who have read Chinese Gleams of Sufi Light or the Sage Learning of Lu Xi will see, what I'm trying to do today is deeply inspired by that word. Right, so to dive in, during the height of Muslim power in South Asia, 16th to 17th centuries, Muslim nobles of the Mughal Empire facilitated the translation of numerous Hindu Sanskrit texts into the Persian language, including scriptures like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. These translations were often produced by teams of Hindu and Muslim scholars brought together to accomplish this challenging task collaboratively. This remarkable meeting of the Hindu and Islamic traditions, two traditions so divergent in many of their basic assumptions, concepts, practices, and beliefs, required a language and an intellectual framework to mediate their nascent dialogue. It was frequently Ibn al-ʿArabi and his unique system of thought, for lack of a better word, to whom the translators resorted in order to provide that crucial intellectual bridge. So today I'll aim to provide just a brief glimpse into this fertile cross-civilizational dialogue. More specifically, I'll examine a few instances of a Hindu view or doctrine that doesn't often find an immediate analog within Islamic thought, namely the idea of the individual human self as creator of the cosmos, creator of the macrocosmic universe, a position typically reserved for Allah, of course, in conventional Muslim teachings, so-called. This Hindu notion finds varied expression across numerous Sanskrit scriptures, including the Upanishads and the Laghu Yoga Vasishta, the two Hindu texts I'll be discussing today. In analyzing how this Hindu concept was translated into an Islamic Persian vocabulary, we witness the mediating role played by Ibn al-ʿArabi's thought, where his characteristic formulations of, first, the concept of the immutable entities, al-a'yan thabita, and second, his particular interpretation of the Hadith of the Hidden Treasure, which we've heard a lot about today. These two features emerge as especially central conceptual bridges. So the first text that I want to show is this translation from Dar Shikoh, the Mughal Prince Dar Shikoh's translation of 50 Upanishads called the Sir Akbar. I'm not going to dwell on this for very long because I'm using it as a cautionary tale. Dar Shikoh's translators actually eschew relying on Ibn al-ʿArabi, right? They try to translate in a way where they're not using his vocabulary, and certain problems arise. So my caution is ignore Ibn al-ʿArabi at your own peril. That's basically what I'm trying to say here. So this is the first verse of the second chapter from the Taittiriya Upanishad. If you've heard of the Advaita Vedanta formulation, the Hindu tradition of Advaita Vedanta, that Brahman or absolute reality is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. This Upanishad is this sort of locus of that teaching. So just very quickly, we can take a quick look. Again, I don't want to dwell on it. On the left, we have an English translation by Patrick Olivelle. I'm oversimplifying only a little bit, but he tries to do a sort of as non-Vedantic a translation as you could imagine. So this is a justified reading of the Upanishad that's really not interested in being Vedantic at all. So it reads, truth and knowledge, the infinite and Brahman, which means absolute reality. A man who knows them as hidden in the deepest cavity, hidden in the highest heaven, attains all his desires together with the wise Brahman. From this very self, or Atman, did space come into being, from space air, from air fire, etc., etc. So you'll just note that the Sanskrit text is at least not explicit in identifying Brahman, absolute reality, with Atman, the self. Advaita Vedanta is a particular tradition that reads the Upanishads in this way. Our Muslim translators cleave very closely to the Advaitin interpretation. They're very clearly consulting the commentary of the famous founder of the Advaita school, Shankaracharya, for example. So if you read the passage, you'll see that the Muslim translators follow along, and they equate Atman with Brahman. It gives them an out. For instance, here at the start of the second paragraph. Here in the original Sanskrit, it just says, from the self, Atman, this whole cosmos flows forth. Following Advaita Vedanta, the Muslim translators can say, from Brahman, which is to say, Atman, the cosmos pours forth. So they follow Advaita Vedanta, but not relying on Ibn Arabi, sort of still feeling somehow unresolved as Muslim thinkers. They add a very significant change here at the very top, the creator, Afaridgar. Right? There's no resolution to the idea that the whole universe would pour forth from the self, so they equate it with Brahman, and then they call Brahman a creator god, which is not something that Advaita Vedanta would be comfortable with. Right? And so in a way, the original Sanskrit text gets deeply domesticated, you could say, to an Islamic vision thereby. So that's all I want to, just very quickly, you'll notice in a very generic way, right, this repetition of the word Zahir, manifest, manifest, manifest. This is a sort of generic influence from the Ibn Arabi tradition, I would argue, but it's such a background standard feature of Indian intellectual culture by this point that it's not even really relevant to speak of it that way. So all scholarly writing would use a term like that by this point, even though it would come originally from the Ibn Arabi tradition. All right. Next, I'm going to turn to my second text, the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. I have to introduce you to a little bit of vocabulary first. This very pregnant term, Sankalpa. Sankalpa is a very polyvalent Hindu concept. If you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find all of these meanings and actually several more. It can mean intention, will, or resolution, the wish or desire to do something, sort of the mental construction or conceptualization of something, and imagination as well. And in the context of the Hindu scripture I'm talking about, the Laghu Yoga Vasishta, we should add that the imagination is talked about routinely and pervasively as having the capacity to create entire worlds. As the Yoga Vasishta says again and again, this world entire is nothing but sankalpa, nothing but this desire, imagination sort of complex. I'll very briefly summarize what we're going to see in the Yoga Vasishta translations. This idea of sankalpa gets tied up with the Ibn Arabi notions of the hadith of the hidden treasure on the one hand, and the immutable entities, or ayan thabita, on the other. Before I get there, just at a very basic level, sankalpa is a Hindu, also Buddhist idea that is recognizing, it's a profound recognition of our own individual implication in the construction of the world that we perceive around us. And when we perceive something, we supply our memories, our traumas, our individual tastes or preferences or aversions. We supply a whole host of names and categories, right? As Amir was sort of telling us so eloquently, right? We supply all of these strictures that give sort of structure and order to the way that the universe presents itself to us. So in some deep way, we are in fact creating the world. As individuals, we're creating the world that appears to us. We've heard a lot about the hadith of the hidden treasure, and we've heard it quoted a number of times today. So let me just very quickly try to isolate corresponding elements in the hadith of the hidden treasure that line up quite nicely with this idea of sankalpa above, right? God loved to be known or longed to be known. We have an intention-laden desire or love, right? Items 1 and 2 from sankalpa. God's knowledge, right, which in Ibn Arabi's hands, the very beginning of this knowledge is God's conceptualizing of the entire cosmos. Again, a kind of mental construction or conceptualization of all things. Imagination is, of course, front and center to this cosmogonic process in Ibn Arabi's hands. I utterly lack the time to describe Ibn Arabi's idea of imagination. Khayal is this creative entity, this world-creating entity. And of course, this, like sankalpa, the hadith of the hidden treasure is giving an account for creation, right, the origin of the cosmos. As for the immutable entities, for those who aren't familiar with the idea, The immutable entity is sort of our true identity, right? Each and every individual object. Our true identity is our Ayn Thabita, our immutable entity. In other words, the object as God knows it, or us as God knows us as individuals. Our entire existence as individual beings is already fixed or determined in God's eternal knowledge. At the same time, however, since the Ayn Thabita is our truest sort of innermost identity, what we most fundamentally are, the implication is that we are, so to speak, the makers of our own destiny. Whatever we are and whatever happens to us, whatever we become, is already within our own Ayn, and hence entirely determined by us and is up to us. Right? From this perspective, we determine ourselves and our own destiny in a central way, from a certain perspective, even more central than God's. Right? From a certain perspective. This is going to become the bridge for making sense of a concept like sankalpa in Islamic terms. All right. So the Yoga Vasishta was translated numerous times. This one is, this very passage is in the Feshrift, actually, so maybe I'll rush through this one a little bit. You can get a closer treatment of it there. But once again, I'll just point out a few key features. We can read the Sanskrit on the left side. When, just like the wind, which enacts a pulsating power of vibration, the self, Atman, entirely on its own, suddenly enacts a power called sankalpa, desire or imagination. At this time, the self of the world, making itself as if in the form of a discrete semblance or projection that abounds in drive towards sankalpa, it becomes mind or manas. The translation on the other side, I won't spend time reading the whole thing, but you'll just notice these phrases that I've highlighted. The desire to create, right? Brahman, you'll notice the shift, right? They've still gone from Atman to Brahman. They haven't fully resolved the issue that I pointed out earlier, but there's something more subtle going on here. Brahman has the desire to create, and the desire to create appears to Brahman, and then Brahman itself, by itself, desires to display its own perfections and to manifest all these forms and colors. I would argue this is a reference to the hadith of the hidden treasure. There occurs to that singular essence, without name or mark, a determination, a ta'ayyun, which they call, right, the Hindus call mind or manas. The text will later say a distinct manas is manifested to each essence and to each individual entity. It's a bit less direct, but I would argue that this is at least a gesture toward the idea of the ayyan thabita, the immutable essences. Once again, just to make it very clear, all these existence of the world and specified entities of every form and color which come into sight, know these to be nothing other than the form of the real's desire and thought. That very desire and thought of Brahman which shines forth as the whole cosmos. So again, I would argue a clear reference to the hadith of the hidden treasure. But yes, they have shifted the text, right? The Sanskrit text was talking all about Atman. Again, a certain ambiguity has been removed in the Persian version where they go ahead and make it Brahman. Not quite as a simplistic creator God, but still talking about objective reality as opposed to the individual self. Shachiko also translated the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. I won't look at a sample translation, but rather I'll just look at a sort of editorial insertion that the translators threw in there, because they were clearly sort of poring over this problem. And here's the solution that they came up with, which finally does attempt to be faithful to what the Yoga Vasishta is trying to tell us. The translators throw in there, the witnessed world, before its manifest existence, was causeless. It was without cause. The Sanskrit term is akarana, right, without cause. Just like the real, hak, most high. That is to say, it did not have a creator because it was at the level of knowledge. The forms of the real's knowledge, which is an expression for the immutable entities and the realities, are not created by anyone. Once the pre-eternal will demanded that this world come into manifestation, the real Most High became its creator. So the cause for the manifestation of the world is the real's longing to manifest itself. So here I would say quite explicitly, and in a very sort of didactic, almost philosophical way, they're ironing out the problems and explicitly sort of acknowledging the quote-unquote mistake of the earlier translations, right? Giving now, through the lens of Ibn al-ʿArabi, a justification to say, we don't need to refer to a creator here. Right? In a very real, basic way, it's not an act of creation, but rather an act of imagination or God's longing. Let me then change modes a little bit. And how much time do I have? Do you know? 5 minutes? Great. Okay. So let me turn to the wonderful Indo-Persian poet, Abdul Qadir Bedil, who passes away in 1720. And one of his masterful masnavis, the Muhit Azam, the greatest ocean. So not a translation in the formal direct sense, but in a wider sense of the term. Bedil engages the Laghu Yoga Vasishta repeatedly across his works. I'm going to look at one episode where he tells the story of King Lavana, retells the story, which comes from the 3rd chapter of the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. Bedil is a poet who's known to be deeply steeped and learned in the Ibn al-ʿArabi tradition. He doesn't actually use the term Ain Thabita, but I would argue anyone who's familiar with the way Ibn al-ʿArabi deploys this term, you're going to see those fingerprints all over some of the poetry that I'm about to translate for you. Let me quickly express my gratitude to Hagnata Kovac of Howard University. She has a wonderful article called No Journey is Possible Outside of the Heart, where she's really already done most of the work I'm about to show you here. So I'm building on the back of her and just adding a bit of extra analysis to serve my point today, my purposes today. Oops, sorry. So first, a summary of the tale. This is from, again, the last story in chapter 3 of the Laghu Yoga Vasishta. The original Sanskrit is rife with the language of Sankalpa that we've already seen today. A summary of the story is that there's a king named Lavana, and a magician comes to his court. And the magician starts doing all sorts of tricks, which ultimately leads to a wooden pony carrying the horse away. A wooden pony carrying the king away out into the desert. He has no food, he has no water. He eventually encounters a beautiful girl from the untouchable sweeper caste. And in exchange for food, he marries her. He settles down with her. He has many children with her. He actually ends up being kind of happy. But eventually a famine hits the land, and they have to leave. They have to migrate. They still find no food. They have no water. So they decide they choose voluntary death over starvation. Lavana eventually jumps into a fire to immolate himself, at which point, you're probably expecting this, he wakes up back in his court to discover that it was all a dream. Right? So you may think this is just a standard, it was all a dream narrative, right? We've heard countless mystical stories like this. Not so fast. King Lavana, after waking up back in his court, he finds no peace. And so he sets out to find the location where his adventures took place. To his utter bewilderment, and Bedil uses the word hayra, bewilderment, the king finds the settlements of the sweepers, who are still mourning him and his family. Right? So confused, he goes to what Bedil calls the prophet of his time. This is a translation of the Sanskrit term rishi, or sage, for explanation. And the prophet explains that this all happened in order to show the king that the world is illusory and is merely the product of the heart's imagination. So this is Bedil's emphasis, right? The Darshako translation we saw in a more sort of didactic way. They're trying to philosophically iron out the difficulties. Bedil, he offers a bit of that, but that's not his primary objective. He's not really trying to resolve a philosophical question like, who's the creator here? Is it God or is it the human self? Rather, for Bedil, he wants to take an idea like Ain Thabita as first and foremost an existential concern. Right? You are the author of your own bondage, and you can be the author of your own liberation if only you would break free from your self-imposed bondage. So the goal is to break out of that illusion. The aim is not discursive understanding, but rather it is hayrat, bewilderment or perplexity. So very quickly, I can't go through all these examples, but just a few little tastes of this really wonderful section of the Masnavi. Bedil writes, what is the world? The mirror of your own consideration, belief, point of view. Tibar, very hard to translate. Which, owing to the reflection of difference, is covered with dust, ghubar. In this one term, Bedil does so much. It means dust, it means vapor, it means perplexity, it means very small script or writing. Basically, Beda will go on to use this word ghubar, dust, to link up with several of Ibn Arabi's characteristic metaphors and images. He will link it up to the image of the unpolished mirror, the breath of the all-merciful, to hayrat or bewilderment, and to the depiction of all creatures as words or articulations of divine speech. This word, so the veil upon your eyes is only tavahum, right? Imagination or delusion, where it otherwise the pearl would be but a water drop. Tawahum here is the translation of sankalpa. But Baydal is clear here. Tawahum, right? He also sometimes uses the word khayal. It has two sides. We can look at the very next short line here for that idea. It was not the magician who created that deception, rather the heart stirred up that dust. A hiding place for guidance, hedayat. So our imagination is two-faced. It has two sides. On the one hand, what can emerge from the heart's imagination can be a delusion, right? It can mislead us. On the other hand, it can also be a form that eventually leads to our liberation. I won't read them for the interest of time, but you'll see here very quickly just a few iterations of this repeated idea that Beda wants to hammer home. All of this whole drama is happening within your heart. None of it is external to your heart. Everything that you experience, that you become, that you are, emerges from within your own ayn thabita. There is no escaping it. It's not possible. All right. I can't resist reading this one because it's arguably the most close mirroring that Baydal uses that mirrors some of Ibn Arabi's language in the Fusus al-Hikam. Don't suppose that the expanse spread out from Qaf and Noon, the divine command, creative command, right? Kun, yakun. Don't suppose that Qaf and Noon was spread outside of your heart. It was a heart that called out from behind the veil, or the instrument, saz, and with this flash sets the world to flight. If you know, for example, the bezel of Salih in the Fusus al-Hikam, I would suggest that this is very much on Baydal's mind when he wrote this line. All right, let me conclude with these final notes, which get at Baydal's primarily existential concern rather than a philosophical one. He writes, whether you call it world or imagination, khayal, it has spread its wings from the soaring of your desire. Wherever your imagination passes through, according to the measure of your attachment, it leaves a trace. First, it fosters attachment in the heart, then it brings whatsoever it desires into view. So if there's one factor, one variable that sets the difference between a type of imagination that is binding and a type of imagination that is liberatory, it's attachment, at least in the context of this story. That's what you need to break free from. And I'll conclude with this, where Baydal gives his sort of closing argument for how King Levana's experience, the strange scenario that his imagination projected for him, he lived half a lifetime in this completely other world, how that ultimately led him to a place where his imagination could become liberatory rather than binding. Your attachment did not diminish for so long as you prized your condition, right? So long as you valued it. Conditioned by your attachment, 100 such descents at last bring you ascent for your own ascension, miraj, until you girded your loins in pursuit of immolation, being burned, right? Jumping into the fire, which is what he did when he finally sort of gave up, right? The form of what you claimed did not manifest. Upon liberating yourself from the snare of hope and fear, it became clear, ayan, we've seen this word, you have only ever dwelled in a place of your own self. Thank you very much, all.
Next speaker. The next speaker is Professor Sachiko Murata. Is a scholar of comparative philosophy, mysticism, and a professor of religion and Asian studies at Stony Brook University. Professor Murata has published many scholarly articles. Thank you. So our next speaker, is this on still? No, it's out. Yeah. Our next speaker is Professor Sachiko Murata, who's a scholar comprised of philosophy and mysticism and a professor of religion and Asian studies at Stony Brook University. Professor Murata has published many scholarly articles and a number of books which explore the interrelationships between Islamic and East Asian thought, especially in the writings of Huiro, the Muslim Confucianist, who wrote numerous tracts in Chinese from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Professor Murata has been the director of Japanese studies at Stony Brook and regularly teaches Introduction to Japanese Studies, Japanese Buddhism, Feminine Spirituality and World Religions, and Islam and Confucianism. Among her many books, her last book, the third on the Huiro, was published in 2018 and titled The First Islamic Classic in Chinese, Wang Dayo's Real Commentary on the True Teaching. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Murata.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Before I have to really thank both of us, my husband and myself, for the organizer of this conference, because we don't know this is for our honor. And this morning we found out. Great surprise. Especially for Ali, who really concerned our health. I'm very grateful for you. Only 4 Islamic texts on issues of theology and Sufism are known to be translated in Chinese before 20th century. All 4 were in Persian, were written by well-known Sufi teachers. 2 of these texts are from the 13th century, namely Murata, Ibn al-ʿArabi, and the Maqsad Aqsad Aziz Nasafi. 2 more were written by Abdurrahman Jami, who is the prolific 15th century propagator of Ibn al-ʿArabi school of thought. One of Jami's 2 books, Salawaye, which was translated by Liuqi in the early 18th century, and which I translated into English in Chinese Gleams of Sufi Light. The other is Ash'at al-Lamat, The Rays of the Flashes, which is Jami's commentary on Iraqi's Lamat. As is well known, Iraqi wrote The Flashes, which is an exquisite little text on divine love, after having attended the lectures on the Fusus of Hekam by Sadhguru Gunabi. So in fact, we have 3 Chinese texts in we have 3 Chinese texts pertaining to the line of Ibn al-ʿArabi and their student. The translator of Jami's commentary on the Flashes into Chinese was Shi Yunshan. He was one of the earliest and most active members of School of Thought, known as Huiro, the Muslim Confucianist. He was also involved with the translation of both Murata al-Ibad and Maqsad Aqsad. He was born around 1635 and still alive in 1697 when he wrote the preface to the genealogy of the Huiro that one of his students composed under his direction. We do not know when she translated rates, but from the genealogy, we know that he found it the most difficult of the Persian text with which he worked. In the book, she uses the pen name Ponachi, which means something like the fool in a ruined grove. One of the outstanding traits of the text is she's attention to poetry, which plays a major role in the original Persian. When Liuqi translated Lawaye about 50 years later, he dropped most of Jami's quatrains. In contrast, Ponachi translated every poem, and he did so with a flair that makes the poetry thoroughly Chinese. As he remarks in an aside after translating one of the poems, I once said that poetry should be like the wind of the 8 directions. Indeed, the subtlety of poetry often left me wondering which direction the wind was blowing from. Before I look at the Wujudi metaphysics as reflected in Chinese translation of the rays of the flashes, let me remark that I have been working on this text for 4 years, but I found the most difficult text, and then any text which I've studied before. One of the most difficult part of the original Persian text is Jami's introduction, in which he defined important technical terms that are used in Iraqi's text and in his own commentary. In the first 29 sections of the introduction, he addresses wujud in terms of its basic thought, namely that is necessary and that is possible, a standard discussion in philosophy as well as in Wujudi Sufism. The contrast between necessary and possible is familiar to anyone who has studied the history of Western or Islamic philosophy. We need to remember, however, that Islamic philosophy and theological Sufism were practically unknown in the Chinese language at this time. So our translator had to devise terminology for new concept. Wujud was not the problem. Ponachi rendered as being, a basic term in Neo-Confucian thought. He translates possible as seeking and necessary as non-seeking. In the rest of the text, he contrasted two about 70 times. After making a distinction between necessary and possible, Jami explained that the possible is defined by its need for an additional something in order to display its traces, and that this addition is called wujud. In his translation of the sentence, Ponachi writes that word wujud in Arabic and with Chinese transliteration. Then he explained its meaning in his own word. It is the undifferentiated being of the root suchness. The term suchness, which scholars sometimes translate as self-soul, is one of the favorite terms of Muslim Confucianism for the divine essence. Suchness, like wujud, can only be asserted or defined. Having explained that the possible thing needs the addition of existence in order to become manifest, Jami then points to the absolute realness of wujud as understood by Ibn al-ʿArabi and his major followers. Here and in other books, Jami refers to this school of thought as those who support the notion of wahdatul wujud. The first section of the rays, however, is only place in the text where Jami mentioned actual expression wahdatul wujud. He also mentioned the word Sufi for only 2 times in the text. He writes, the Sufis who afford oneness of existence, who are the folks unwavering witnessing, takes the position that essence of necessary is same as this addition, which is existence. By its essence, it encompasses all things and pervades all things, and all things exist because it encompasses and pervades them. In his translation of this passage, Ponachi transliterated the word Sufi and renders the oneness of existence as non-duality of the root suchness. He writes, the Sophia, who are the people of clear opening and witnessing, and who afford the non-duality of the root suchness, says that the substance of the visible is the root suchness that is relied upon. this root suchness encompasses and surrounds a myriad beings and secretly travels in their midst. The manifestation of myriad beings is based on pervation by the root suchness. A little bit later in the text, Jami said that the reality of existence is beyond having any connection to knowledge, unveiling, and witnessing. Ogunnaike translates this sentence with his word. Its principle is one, and its level is not known, manifested, or seen in any of these respects. He then adds a comment to remind his readers that this is also the position of the Confucian philosopher. He says, this is what the Confucianists of Song Dynasty meant when they said that it is impossible to talk about what is beyond the great ultimate. Any mention of Wujudi in Islamic philosophy naturally brings up the issue of Mahiyya, quiddity, with which Wujudi is typically contrasted. A thing's quiddity is whatness, the answer to the question, what is it? All things have qualities, with the sole exception of Wujud itself, for we cannot say what it is, only that is. In any case, Ibn al-ʿArabi frequently spoke about the qualities, but most often he calls them the fixed entities, al-āyan al-thabita, so this term became well known in early studies of him. Ogunnaike translates the expression as subtle root. To give some details of how Ogunnaike addresses a relation between the fixed entities and the real wujud, we can look at a short section of Jami's commentary inserted into the midst of his explanation of Flash 17. In this passage, Jami uses another well-known expression for the inner workings of God's knowledge, namely task, a term that Ibn al-ʿArabi brought to the fore with his frequent explanation of the Ogunnaike verse. Each day, he is upon some task. Jami quotes this verse at the beginning of the Flash. Then he says, at the level where the real task and attributes are concealed in the oneness of the essence, the task have the preparedness for manifestation, first at the level of knowledge, and the second at the level of entity. Ogunnaike translates this passage as follows. Without doubt, the root affairs of the real being are originally hidden by the single uniqueness of the root suchness. At this level, the various root affairs have the preparedness first to become manifest at the level of knowledge, and second to become manifest at the level of seeing. Now, Jami defines a fixed entity, and Ogunnaike talks about such a root. Jami writes, once the tasks become distinct in knowledge, then their forms with knowledge, which are called the fixed entities, find the preparedness for existence in entity. Ogunnaike writes, when the various root affairs have been allotted and apportioned at the level of knowledge, they are prepared to become manifest to the known forms of the subtle root at the level of seeing. Now, given the title of the conference, I don't remiss if I do not say something about the main topic of Iraqi book. It is that God's love for human lover, along with human response to God's love, erases the illusion of the lover's independent existence and brings about union with a real existence. I choose almost randomly the beginning of the Flash 18. Jami gives it the title, explaining the cause of the lover's movement and the seeking, and verifying his everlasting movement and advance. After translating title verbatim, Ogunnaike translates the first part of the text as follows. Originally, lover has both been at the level of knowledge and non-being at the level of seeing. He has in constant firmness and had not yet seen the face of the beloved, with a thing that is after his being at the level of thing. For in the level of knowledge, he has looking and hearing in conformity with the level. Suddenly, the voice singing calm startled him from the dream of non-being. Having heard this singing voice, he started to move. This clarifies a circumstance that was not seen before and that became manifest with a manifestation in him. The circumstance from that, he received the mandate to move from non-being to being. Based on this movement, he attained being in the world of sin. After this section, Iraqi quote 2 half lines of poetry in the original text. The first in Persian reads, "Love put too much into my makeup." The second in Arabic reads, "Sometimes the ear falls in love before the eye." In the Chinese text, Bonachi turns these 2 half lines into 4 verses, each with 7 characters. His recreation of the poetry is this: "The song of the voice entered the ear, and the heart was startled. With the awareness of wind and wave, all of nature came to be. Following fast awareness of the ear, he woke to the real beauty. Entering secretly the mystery of the mystery, he enjoyed nature and heaven." The Chinese translation of the text continues as follows: "The singing voice will never come to an end, and this dance will never be cut off. For what is thought is the magnificence of real being will never come to an end from the standpoint of allotted and apportioned root affairs and various appearances. At this moment, the lovers singing and dancing at this point. Wherever I look, the light of your face appears. Whenever I listen, the news of love comes forth." Thank you.
Thank you for all the panelists for all the papers. Now we open it up for questions, Q&A. Also, folks on Zoom, please type questions, and we are actually looking at it, so we'll read it as soon as we get it.
Transmission complete.
This question about his Thank
you very much, Dr. Nair. Your talk stimulated my keen interest in the subject of the question of the influence of Ibn al-ʿArabi in India and especially in Indo-Persian tradition. We find that Ibn al-ʿArabi and the Arabic tradition heavily influenced Indo-Muslim works, or what I was found in knowledge, and he was instrumental behind the whole discipline of Islamic knowledge. So you mentioned basic and he comes in that tradition, and before that, we have a number of scholars like Oludamini and Mary Muhammad Jaisi. So Oludamini well versed in Persian, Arabic, and Mary Jaisi, who wrote the Fatma, and again great Sufi poet called Hassan al-Hind. And on the other hand, we also find that in the 15th century, when Akbarite tradition influenced Indo-Muslim tradition, to the extent of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, who introduced Deen Ilahi as a state religion, very much inspired by the unity of the religious ideals. In this time, there is another movement. There are traditionalist Muslim scholars who, in order to confront female life, introduce antithesis to Wahdatul which is an alternative to Wahdatul which is Wahdatul Shuhud, unity in the universal. And this actually got a parallel practice among all schools of thought in India. Now we find that all schools of Islamic thought in India are more adherent to Wahdatul Shuhud rather than Wahdatul Bari, except for these two big orders like Ishtiya. So how this course in India actually, how do you see at this course? Why Wahdatul Bari was actually lost its impact to Wahdatul Shuhud?
Thank you. Where to begin? Spend all evening trying to answer that question. I agree. It is the time period, right? It is the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century. There's a lot more of the archives uncovered. We've barely begun to scratch the surface, but all indications we have now, prior to the colonial period, prior to the sense of collapse of the Muslim world, there isn't this sort of fundamental fault line of what the Wujudi, which is what the Wujudi. So Hindi himself, Professor Chittick's written eloquently about this in his watershed article that Ibn al-ʿArabi is common. Sir Hindi is also a founder of what the Shuhud, views himself as an interpreter of Ibn al-ʿArabi, recommends that it is because there are other words to advance, but specifically would suggest that it would be best to think of somebody who's actually thinking within the ambit of the school of Ibn al-ʿArabi, doing innovative, creative things. But it's not this sort of fundamental dichotomy on at all. What the Wujud is a broad category for a very, very diverse spectrum of views and opinions. And very, very long story short, it's in the context of colonialism, the context of partition, that the sort of trauma of a centralized Pakistan and India gets projected back into the past. And what the Shuhud basically gets projected as proto-Pakistan, what the Wujud gets projected as proto so-called secular, liberal, open, tolerant India, present reality style. Which is deeply problematic, historically. To turn to some Ibn al-ʿArabi and Murata, he's another sort of facet of the spectrum of things that fall under a very diverse umbrella of Wujud. We know that there are hard-carrying Wujudis, so to speak, who have trouble with what is an argument, especially what Akbar is doing. One of my favorite ways of illustrating this is correspondence of Sachiko, who I mentioned in my talk. Prince Sachiko uses the air of sort of this Akbar approach, and who's pretty undeniably the preeminent scholar and interpreter at the time, Ibn al-ʿArabi. Ibn al-ʿArabi sort of chastising Sachiko as he's so hard to be chastised, Prince, right? And saying, like, you maybe have a bit more ego than you think. Why don't you read more and study more? He's basically encouraging Sachiko to be a little bit more of, for lack of a better term, a traditionalist, right? We have a Sharia, we have a tradition, we have philosophy and rational sciences, Quran. Why don't you read more of this stuff and submit your ego to the tradition, right? And this is the sort of representative of the Wujud, telling Sachiko to be more traditionalist. So there's that sort of fault line that is sort of the fuqaha versus the Sufis, or it's the ulama versus what the Wujud. On the ground is just far more complicated. And the fault lines just don't line up with the way that they get projected back into the past nowadays because of contemporary and internationalism. The last thing I'll say is that you pointed to certain institutions like the Abundance, the Lobbies, etc. Who, yes, right, in the modern imagination, they align themselves with it. But don't make the mistake of thinking that means that the Wujud is somehow gone, right? What the Wujud is all over the poetry of Malaysia, which is incredibly popular, right? It's all over all varieties of forms of culture and thought and practice to this day, even if they're not using the term, even if they're not necessarily direct commentators on the Heyman or something like that. The impact of what we do on South Asian culture, it's all over the place to this day, and these states are still around. They just and not really the ones that make the news headlines.
Please go ahead. Yes. Yes.
If I'm wrong, please correct me if I'm not, but wouldn't you say that Sachiko, working with the framework of, Dan Tafa or Heyman is more closely aligned with Swahili than Arabic?
I wouldn't say so. Like the term that I pointed to in that first text, there's a lot of rhetoric of Nur and Ishraq that's floating around the whole court, and it's integrated into the way that the court projects itself and talk about itself. But it doesn't come across to me as a sort of deep learning in the sort of writing tradition. Sachiko doesn't, when he's writing philosophically, it doesn't seem to mirror the writing of Suhrawardi beyond this just general rhetoric of light. But to the other side of your question, as you line up with Ibn al-ʿArabi, Sachiko, he really doesn't feel the need to align himself with any rare thinker. He really views himself as the Prince Sage who had access to this kind of knowledge that I don't know if it's he doesn't it's very, very difficult about it. And so just to give a little bit more illustration to this idea of a spectrum of approaches that fall under the umbrella of what Wujud. Sachiko is approaching prophet. I think you see it in a little bit of the Upanishads translation that I tried to show you. He's really inspiring a language that is, as much as possible, sort of beyond any tradition, right? He's trying to translate the Upanishads into a language that's not Islamic, but it's trying to be generic, right? To try to illustrate this, I mentioned the word bliss. There's any of a number of Islamic Sufis and Arabic terms to the Jews to translate that. Wujud or Wujdan would be a great example. Right? You can get into Wujud and being, and bliss and ecstasy. No, he chose a very generic word, surur, joy, which is a dictionary word, but it's not a technical term. It's not a term that can be the object of great speculation and commentary over the years. So, oversimplifying, Sachiko is looking for a kind of, at least vocabulary that transcends all tradition. Whereas, as we've seen many times throughout this conference today, Ibn al-ʿArabi is very insistent on being a Muslim, right? There is no language, there's no vocabulary outside of the Quran. It's through the particular form that you get to the all-embracing, all-comprehensive knowledge. It's not you just trying to step outside of it. And so, yes, there's the advanced Ibn al-ʿArabi in the Sachiko, but I think it's also a question whether you be best to characterize him as trying to represent that tradition or follow the footsteps of that tradition. He's really created to an extent that might not be the best way to think about it.
Questions? Yes, please.
This is Professor Murata. I found myself wondering about the idea of freedom, the spontaneous things itself idea. Mostly Taoist in some ways. The Ziran.
Amen. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, Ziran. Ziran is Z-I-R-A-N, the spontaneous stuff, so that nature is spontaneously just happening.
Yes.
Yes. I wonder, is that term also present in the translation currently that you're going to do? It's just something happening. right? Just that they are. I accept it, but I'm wondering
if he means self, so self-touchness, actually the nature, right? Right now the Dylan is used to say nature. That's right. So not the suchness, and the root suchness is something which he uses for essence, right? Pronouns uses for essence, root suchness. So suchness is very often used with combination with the other word.
So that would then be included then, so included in the larger suchness of everything. That suchness is the broader term, and zero would be subset of that.
You see, the word zilan is not always used, right? Root suchness is more. The root, right? Root suchness, it is used very often because root of something, right? So that's for essence, he uses root suchness. Right? Root suchness. But sometimes suchness itself is used. But when it uses root suchness, and then I think also Ryuji uses root suchness in order to say about the root, not the essence of existence.
Thank you.
Please go ahead. Yes.
While we're waiting, sorry, just to be on the Darshako question, I should distinguish the early Darshako from the late Darshako, right? When he's writing the last week of his life, Majul Bahrain, and the Upanishad's translation, that's really where this new stage of his intellectual development takes off. In early Darshako is something quite different, and I'd qualify my answer.
Yeah, just testing. Yeah.
Yes, I have just comments on something the mirror, that was wonderful. Mirror of different shapes, because for conversations we need that. And thank you for that. So that's imagery was really good. Alhamdulillah. You were trying to cover so much, and you went too fast for my slow brain. The Atman Brahman thing, I've been working with that, and suddenly in Ota Bhatta's book, The Doctrines of Sufism, which is one of the best books on Sufism, I keep on rereading all the time. I suddenly came across him saying, in Hinduism, everything comes from Atman. And from my reading of Hinduism, I went from Brahman to Atman. So I wasn't quite sure what you were saying. So what is the resolution? Why did Bhagat say that Atman was the absolute origin of everything? And he didn't even mention Brahman, in fact. So I just want you to resolve it for me.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
The tradition of Hinduism, there is a uncompromising equation, right? Atman, the innermost self, right, the deepest layer of who we are, is identical with Brahman. Right, the reality out there. So the point that I was just trying to make is there's various competing traditions of interpreting the Upanishads. There's a tradition known as the Vaita Vedanta, which interprets the Upanishad to be teaching the exact opposite, that Brahman and Atman are eternally separate and can never be identical. Patrick Oliver, whose translation I used, he translates Atman as the body, a physical corporeal body, because he's convinced that way back when, in the BC times, when the Upanishads were being written, he's convinced that was the dominant strain of thought at the time. I'm not sure he's right about that, but that's his claim as a philologist. So my point was just to show that the Muslim translators that Darshako brought together, Hindu Pundits and Muslim translators, very clearly were relying on Advaita Vedanta commentaries, specifically the commentary of Shankaracharya. And that's very much the way that they try to read it. The simple point I was trying to make with that passage is they lack the resources to define the Persian way of comfortably describing the self creates the whole cosmos. It's hard for a Muslim to make sense of it that way. So they had to insert this extra word, to create, Ahadi God. That word's nowhere present in the Upanishads. It's a Persian word. Ahadi God. Ahadi God, creator, the creator. Ishvara. Basically. Yeah, so this is a creator God, which is a notion that's just not there in the Upanishads. Even Advaita Vedanta wouldn't be comfortable thinking of Brahman that way. Does that clarify?
Oh, I asked this later, but I think I got it. The other thing is, when I entered the realm and religion, one thing I found that we did everything in the company, and I understand, we believe that that's why it's so important that the religion to understand the inner dimensions because we are all same. So now, when back to that, if you want the neural division and could you say that underlying this? Well, not, I guess this is difficult to put into words. I think you're trying to get your to say that could we say that we disappear. I mean, what's the perfect man? Disappeared. It's not there anymore. So, put that together, Batman, having fostered, whatever.
Right. Yes. So Advaita Vedanta itself, there's sort of different competing models of how best to describe the relationship between Brahman and so Atman is Brahman, right? At that level, you don't need to invoke the mirror. There's an identity there. But Advaita Vedanta, has to recognize that at least experientially, we experience the world as discrete individual human beings, right? We have bodies and we have minds, and I seem to be different than you, right? So there's at least a seeming multiplicity of individual souls. At that level, there's sort of competing models within Advaita Vedanta, and one of them, what's called Pratibindavada, makes use of the language of mirrors, of reflections. So their preferred language is to say that all of these, thousands and thousands of individual human souls in the world are reflections of Atman or Brahman. There's another school which would rather emphasize that all of this is illusion. And so they use a language of projection, right? The implication is that it's sort of a false projection. So the mirror model emphasizes the continuity between individual souls and Atman, Brahman. The other model emphasizes the way that this is all illusion, and the only real thing is Brahman or Atman.
I totally agree on the mirror question. It's super interesting. There's a mirror, a poem, one of the shortest poems in the Microsoft translations.
Yes.
Or generally, one of the longest discussions and most interesting discussion with students. I highly recommend discussing this with students. We have two questions on Zoom for Professor Murata. Professor Murata, the question goes by, struck by the absence of Wujudi language in the Chinese translations you spoke about, most strikingly in the translation of the necessary and possible in existence. Can you say more about the role of this category in Chinese thought or lack of it? Is there anything like a copula in Chinese philosophy?
I don't quite get the question.
Saying they didn't talk much about being in the translations that you read. They said they didn't talk much about being, wujud. They just talked about
But why? Asking why?
Yeah, asking why. He said, "Is there a copy?"
Is there a copula in Chinese philosophy?
Chinese language is
Is that part of the sentence? Or is it like...
You is so commonly used. Actually, we see that you is as we want to be. Whenever you wanted to have something else, it's you with other word combined, right? So now you're being, but seeker, right? Seeker, meaning you too, is seeking, you too, you meaning having to, and then Uchu, no seeking. Okay, so the you is in every place is used, but it's basically it means being. But then whatever you think about, very often this you is used. It's like is, or English is.
Thank you, Professor. Then another question, and perhaps also inspired by this discussion. Can suchness or essence change or transform? Or is it forever fixed in God's knowledge, unable to move, as it were?
Suchness?
Yes.
It is not possible to change it otherwise.
Suchness is Wujud. Wujud is unknown. By definition, it is simply there. We cannot find it. The root suchness is. Other things have suchnesses, but it's not root.
Thank you, Professor.
Exactly, the essence of the very it's using a little bit in Arabic. But the essence is effectively Wujud. Existence, the real existence, the necessary existence.
Yeah. It's fair for the person asking the question that to hear what you're saying. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
One more time.
So I'm quite new. But not a translation of the issue of talking about the original in the English, just for useful purpose. They are published in Shaykh. But I think it's a really nice translation, root suchness of Wujud in the sense of the necessary Wujud, that which is at the root of all reality, which is precisely the essence. The essence is Gato Asma, the possessor of the names. The essence is indefinable, it is unknowable, but what do we talk about? We talk about its names, how it designates itself, how we designate it. But the essence is unknowable. You'll see my paper, the later tradition makes it very, very clear that the essence is Wujud. Well, you don't have to necessarily say a way to talk about it. We don't know what the essence is, we don't know what Wujud is. Wujud is presupposed in everything, and the essence is also presupposed in everything. The essence is also called the He-ness. He is with you. He is with you wherever you are. That you, there is the entirety of all reality. Doesn't matter where you are, where anything is, the essence is there. He is there. Root suchness is a very nice Chinese way of saying it, especially these texts repeatedly used almost invariably to express this notion of essence, which is also extremely important in both of all schools of Arabic.
Yes. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, I think there was a hand there. Fifth row. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for bringing the presence of those main and meaning names. What scholars and what hearts I just couldn't help thinking, as you were talking about the vows that he brought upon himself, it was so reminiscent of what the Sheikh Ibn al-ӓrabi talks about himself, what his role is. And what kept me coming up was Rahmatan lil-ʿalamin, that really feels like really falling like we would use the Buddhist term, that this is the Bodhisattva. If you could just say something about that, please.
I don't know what more to say about it, but yeah, when I read this, I was like, oh yeah, this is like a Bodhisattva vow. This is amazing. And you see certain things in the Hadith about this as well, to the Prophet, praying for mercy for all of creation, everything, his enemies, animals, trees, plants, things like this. And this seems to be something that's been passed down in this lineage of Sufis in West Africa and Sufis other places as well too. To bring it to this idea of translation, it's interesting to me in this sense in two ways. One, because it's translating Rahman from Ar-Rahman to everything. The Nabawi hand motion, translate the mercy and translate it. Now, I think elsewhere in Arabi refers to the Hadith Nawafil. So I'm starting to keep approaching me until I love and he said these people are the real translators, they're the translators of the real, because they're the hand of the real. So they're kind of translating the real into this kind of, well, they're seeing with the real's eyes, they're hearing with the real's ears. So they're translating the Rahman, the presence of the real, into everything. So this is our function as human beings. And then the other one is then how that is passed down. So that's a kind of translation from the real, from Haq to Khalq, the translation of that mercy from this non-delimited mode into all of these delimited modes. And then there's a translation, how do you pass that down from generation to generation? And there are these kind of horizontal lines of transmission. But when I was reading Sheik Dan Tafa and thinking about this for this conference, the way in which it's passed down is they make you kind of fall in love. But you have to fall in love and have this intense love. You have to throw yourself into the fire, basically, and go back to Haq. So it looks like a historical kind of vertical transmission, but it's really a series of people throwing themselves into the fire of the real. Just kind of like with the idea of Tajdeed of this screen, it looks like my arm is moving, right? But my arm's not moving. It's just a series of things coming from the real, from the projector there. So it appears to be this horizontal continuity, but from another point of view, it's really just these kind of vertical lines. So the way in which this seems to be translated temporally is they create this really, really intense longing and devotion that makes people kind of direct themselves fully towards the real. And then the real is the hearing which they hear, seeing which they see, etc. And then it keeps going like that. So anyway, thank you for that clarification.
Yes, please.
Thanks so much. I have a follow-on. I was thinking about, just before you answer this question, because it's kind of an extension of that thought process. I was thinking about, you know, that quote about how when an elder dies, it's like a library that runs out. And then you mentioned that Sheik Dan Tafa had started writing these moments.
Yes.
And I don't know what my question is, but I'm wondering what you think about how someone throws themselves into the fire at 16 versus as an elder, and what that.
So elder in this context doesn't mean old person. I'm going to have to be very clear about this. He said, like in any French, he's like, I'm not talking about someone who has a lot. When I say elder, I'm not talking about someone who's advanced in age. So I'm talking about someone who's mature, someone who has knowledge, somebody who's done suluk. Right? So he says you have some old men who are babies, and you have some young people who are elders. Right, so that's why he says when an elder dies, it's a library that burns. Some people die, you know, it's like a junk mail that burns. It's spam that goes away. Some people it's a library. So it's an elder that dies. So it's people who have done suluk.
So I guess even if it's not physical age, what do you make of that difference? Is it a difference in character? Is it a difference in like genetics? Is it a difference?
No, it's a difference in realization of potentialities. It's a different realization of potential. We all have those potentialities within us. It's a question of realization of those potentialities.
Beautiful, thank you.
Another question from Sun. This is perhaps also a follow-up for you. You talked about the African Sheikh mentioning knowledge transfer between generations cannot be passed over by written books because knowledge comes from God as light to the chest of human being. So keys are kept with the human being. So I suppose this is more of
so it's not that knowledge can't be done through written text. So the quote by Shatabi was, knowledge was first in the chest of people, then it was put in books with the keys still in the hands of people. So written books are helpful, right? Translating Sheik Dan Tafa's text, but you can't confuse the knowledge with the stuff that's in the books. Books are helpful means of transmitting knowledge. Right, so as I said at the end, you could say the knowledge or Nizam or Ibn al-ʿArabi or the Prophet or God, it transcends what's in the books, but also transcends that transcendence, and so it's immanent in the words, in the discourse, in the books as well too. But the books are they're almost like gym equipment, right? You use them to transform yourself. You can't confuse, fitness is not, a set of barbells is not fitness, right? So books are useful for acquiring knowledge, for acquiring character dispositions, for acquiring the Shaykh, for realization and things like that. But it's not like the book is a realized human being. That's what I mean.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, looking at we can get to the concept of the connection in the mirrors. We're going to talk about zikr and remembrance, polishing the heart, which I think can be reflecting. Again, this reflection upon the multiple reflections. Where is it static? Where is it changing? How is it co-created? These are the concepts that are going through my mind. That yes, we practice zikr, and yet the knowledge that is coming through people is just from the heart to heart, but it is connected to the divine heart. So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more. So, on the imagery, I was getting it.
The image of the mirror? Okay, I mean, there's Nair has a great passage in the Fusus where he explains that we're lots of different ways you can look at it, but we're a mirror for God. We as human beings are a mirror for God, and God is a mirror for us as well too. So the cool thing about mirrors is nobody's ever seen the surface. Ibn al-ʿArabi points this out. Nobody's ever seen the surface of a mirror. Right, all you see is the reflections. If it's a perfectly clear mirror, if it's not all the way polished or something, then you still see the mirror, or you see its shape or something like that. So the purpose of the polishing is, in a certain sense, to become invisible, to transcend all of those delimitations, so that it perfectly reflects whatever comes to it. Right, so this is the laqad sara qalbi qabilan kulla suratin. My heart became capable of receiving every form. If you have a semi-polished piece of brass or something like that, it can't show you all the colors, everything that has a yellowish tint to it, right? It's not capable of receiving every form because it doesn't have the istidad, it doesn't have the capacity for that. So it has to be polished all the way. If not, elsewhere in the Futuhat, other places says that however nice, how much you try, whatever your mizaj, your constitution will limit you. You don't have the perfect constitution, but the Prophet ﷺ does. So that's why you have to try to follow his sunnah and try to, in a certain sense, look towards his mirror, not just towards your mirror. So in your efforts, you try to expand yourself and make your mirror as much in the mold of the mirror of the Prophet as possible, but look to the Prophet's mirror. So you're kind of looking at the reflection in the mirror of the Prophet. And that the reflection that appears in there will always be stronger, greater, more intense than the reflection that appears in your own mirror, in your own heart. So there's a story that Ibn al-ʿArabi also tells about this person at the time of Abu Yazid al-Bastami was walking around saying, I've seen God. And, he was very happy about this. People were very impressed. And so somebody said, oh, let me take him to see Abu Yazid al-Bastami, who's also a great Sufi. So the guy comes in the marketplace, sees Abu Yazid al-Bastami and falls down and dies. All right, and they said, what? This person saw God and he was fine. He sees you and he dies. And Abu Yazid said, yes, when he saw God to the limit, the extent of his capacity. They said that. When he saw me, he saw God to the limit, the extent of my capacity, which is more than his. So that's why it knocked him out. So that's why Ibn al-ʿArabi says you have to follow the Prophet. Follow the Prophet because he has the greatest, that his mirror is the cleanest, the clearest. And so in following him, that's how the way this kind of transmission works with this kind of chain of mirrors and reflections. In brief.
Thank you for that.
I feel bad answering this. This is like ridiculous.
There is a follow-up for Professor Chitik and Professor Murata. Would this definition of the essence that you gave, which seemed to say that the essence is unknowable, apply to the essence of our own soul, the human soul, psychologically speaking? Because then we as conscious beings will not be able to know our essence, which is unknowable logically. Please say a few words regarding the nature of our soul, which seems to project desire in the world. So this is a follow-up from Professors Chitik and Professor Murata.
Let me address that. The essence of everything is one. That we know, no questioning. You made this mask, the same essence. He is with you wherever you are. He's with this cup wherever it is. Now, your essence, to make a very long story short, is your fixed entity. It is you as God has known you forever. There's no beginning and there's no end. You do not know your own fixed entity. You are coming to understand it moment by moment with the new creation. Once he says be to you, you come into being. The fixed entity starts showing its capacity, but it's already known to God. Now, is it possible to know the essence? Essence per se, no, but you can know your own essence. That is, this of course is a very rare passation, as it is known to God. This is what, of course, many people, Al-Ghazali already calls this wajhullah. The face looking at you, God's face looking at you is your face looking at God. If you can know that face, you are knowing your fixed entity, or the specific face. This is what Ibn al-ʿArabi usually calls al-wajh al-khas. That is the specific face of God looking at you. Now, you can know that face. You will be knowing God, but not God per se. God, inasmuch as he is, if you like, your archetype. Inasmuch as he knows you eternally. So many sheikhs talk about knowing the essence, but what they mean, Ibn al-ʿArabi makes it very, very clear, is they know that their mirror is filled to capacity by knowing their fixed entity in God. But it doesn't mean they know God. God is not knowable. So that's the basic position of all of these texts. There's certainly still a bit in there. John used to, I mean, we don't have to do the history.
There's a Sheik Dan Tafa actually has one of his works on commentary on Julius and Sana Kamal. He has this discussion about, is God's knowledge limited by the fact that he is unknowable? Like, so God knows that he's unknowable, that he doesn't know himself. And he's limited by that. And so he goes through different positions that different people have. And so he says that, like Sanusi and Jili say, yes, God is ultimately unknowable, because knowledge is the encompassment of the knower, of the known by the knower. and God's knowledge doesn't encompass all of his essence. But Dan Tafa doesn't like this. He says, no, because if either way you come down on this, you're claiming knowledge of God. So he says, the most that you can say is that this exceeds our knowledge, because we can't encompass God's knowledge. So just say it exceeds our knowledge, and just leave it at that. You can't say one way or the other. Sheik Dan Tafa, the person I was presenting him.
Just one word. Remember how often Ibn al-ʿArabi says, La ya'lamu illallah. No one knows God but God. That's it.
Yeah. So I think we have a few more minutes for final question. Please go ahead. Yes.
I'd like to know the translation of some kalpa into al-a'yan al-thabita and al-kanz al-makhfi. What did it do to the conceptual shape of that concept? Because concepts function in a broader ideological and practical frameworks, and so establishing certain equivalences, did it restrict that concept in its own framework? Did it expand it? Did it restrict it? Or did it was it just to build bridges, as you said? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on which translation you're looking at. Different translators, different strategies, and by the time period I'm talking about, you really can start to talk about a tradition of translating these terms. Right, every later translator has read the previous ones and is making conscious choices, and this is sort of an active line of inquiry, you could say. And so different translators do different strategies. Some translators are pretty keen to domesticate these Sanskrit texts to Islamic theological, lexicographical norms. And so, for instance, the very sort of conundrum that I was pointing to in my talk, are you translating Sankalpa in a way that is genuinely open to a vision of the individual human being the creator of the cosmos? A lot of translators couldn't accept that, right? And so a certain current is established of translating that aspect of Sankalpa out of the term. There's another variety of translation that is more my style. I agree. Where the translators really revel in a kind of ambiguity, and they're much more comfortable letting things remain in the Persian text that would be alienating to a Muslim audience. And some of the most fun moments are where they'll just throw in a Islamic conceptual equivalent, and it often does not make obvious sense. It just doesn't. It's this very fertile, pregnant equivalence, and you look at it and say, what did they have in mind there? I think it speaks to a kind of humility on the part of those translators to say, I need to step aside and let this text speak for itself, and I'll throw something in there that will now liberate a reader to sort of come up with their own associations and their own sort of fertile thoughts and imagination.
Thank you. There's a final common question that I left towards the end. I'll read together. In Arabi offers innumerable examples of uniting theoretical and experiential realized knowledge of God. It's clear to realize that our apparent realist in the level of forms is illusory compared to God's reality, the public God, as pure Wujud. Being quadratic compared to God, we are obviously finite. It's a prayer. So the deep aspect of our not being God in His essence is clear. But how can we come to more deeply realize our connection to God in the realm of being, or as existing eternally in God? As Ayn al-Thabita, how can we increasingly taste this in this lower world? Does Sheikh al-Akbar offer us a clear path of ascent? I'll give all hands 30 seconds to conclude this wonderful answering the unanswerable. Please go ahead.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think there are kind of two answers. Maybe one is that this is just going on all everything is huwa la. It's as much la as it is huwa, and even the la is a form of huwa, and the huwa is a form of la. So it's kind of like this is the way things are all the time anyway. So it's not about necessarily experiencing or seeing wild and crazy things. All of your experiences are visionary experiences. All of your experiences are like tajalli revelations. Everything that's happening is kind of miraculous and wonderful. And sometimes even just reading that can be enough to, or hearing that can be enough to be like, whoa, that's pretty cool. But then for this to be kind of a permanent dynamic, for you to achieve the maqam la maqam, where you really do this, he's really clear. It's the sunnah. It's the following the sunnah of the Prophet. The Prophet is the model par excellence of the mode of being that unites the huwa and la huwa. And the more you live like him, do the things that you do, that he did and does, and cultivate similarity to him inwardly and outwardly, the more you will experience and taste of his, have the same kind of experiences that characterize this dynamic station of no station, where you cycle through all the stations and come to know the special face of God, the face. Your face turned towards God, that's God's face turned towards you.
I was just going to say this one. Yeah. It's like I got 30 seconds. It's fine to teach you everything. You can do a good job of what they're going to do. Well, on their areas of I think we find something about what part of the state. The stable part can't read you're always the recipient, you're always the mirror, and otherwise everything's changed. People talk about the public having a sense of the public. It's constantly changing. You take yourself out of your way, you face yourself, then fresh. Right? We're talking about freshness, right? A fresh face, a fresh vision, a fresh manifestation. When you come to a living moment, it's the sunnah and virtue that helps.
Come to know God. Based on how can we come to know God in this lower?
That's the vision of the mirrors that we are.
God has everywhere too. God has one thing in his truth. So you live on this itself to distinguish an anger. I'm relying on visual here, but if it's an anger that comes from attachment, or it's an anger that comes from faith. That's a living itself.
How much is the best sense?
That was good, right?
Should have been with the hold up the road.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Thank you so much for all your questions and sentiments.